All right, so we will begin a new session, and this will be a few sessions from the book of the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. And I have entitled this series A Passion for Holiness. All right, I think we need to begin with the dumb and obvious observation that this is a song. It is not a law book. It is not a narrative. It is not a book of prophecy. It is a song. And therefore, we need to consider this book being artistic instead of it being intellectual. And the reason I begin this way is because a lot of the commentaries that we read about the Song of Songs actually come from the Western commentaries. And we know that the West has this kind of tendency to be more, to approach any subject from the critical thinking perspective. And therefore, we try to intellectually dissect the book. However, when we look at this as a song, we can actually view this more as an art, and it doesn't have to be, logically coherent in every way. Let me give an example, right? Um, the girl is identified in the book as a Shulamite. Okay, then interpreters have been confused as to what a Shulamite is because Shulam is actually not an actual city in Israel, or it is not an actual city even in the ancient Near East. Or at least as far as archaeology can tell us, right? So they have been confused as to what a Shulamite is. They've tried, for example, to propose it might be similar to Shunammite, but I think this is more out of similarity, and it is not a justifiable interpretation as such. But if we consider Shulamite as probably being symbolic, as opposed to it being literal, then we can give a lot more meaning to the song. For example, the word Shulam bears a lot of resemblance to Hebrew word shalom. Um, and so some commentators have said that the resemblance may mean that this was the, the woman is a woman of Jerusalem. And also it might be a feminine form of the Hebrew name Solomon, right? So a Shulamite, Solomon. So all these resemblances can be brought into the picture, and we can consider this as an art form. Who is the girl? The girl can represent Jerusalem as a woman figure, and therefore as a bride, right? And I think it makes a lot more meaning that way, because then we can even say, and rightly say, that the church is being brought into the picture here, because we too, as a church, we are longing and passionately longing for a groom, and that is Christ. And we too now are guarding our chastity. We are guarding our purity to present ourselves as blameless before God, right? So just the first observation, read this as a song. And by doing that, I think we can bring a lot more meaning into it. Okay, so the reason why I insisted so much on reading this as a song is because a lot of commentaries are indecisive about the Song of Songs. It is a difficult book to interpret. Many have wondered whether it's actually allegorical or whether it is literal, whether it's narrative or whether it is actually a simulated story. And that means whether we should identify this as a period, a real period in Solomon's life. Who is this Shulamite girl, the one that is dark but lovely? And then they try to put into the picture, oh, who are the dark girls from the ancient countries, and that kind of thing. So trying to um, interpret this into a literal story. Who is Solomon writing this book about, or who is he writing this books for, or something like that? Yeah, a lot of people have also asked whether this is a book about an exclusive love or a love triangle. Does it have a singular plot or multiple plots? And what is Solomon's role here? Because really, Solomon is depicted very differently in chapter 3 of the book and chapter 8 of the book. And so a lot of these kinds of questions make interpretation of the book very difficult. And therefore, I would like to actually invite you to read this book along. So I'm not actually presenting the only interpretation of this book, right? But I am trying to convince you that this is the right one. So you can agree or disagree with what I will propose. But this is the way I read it, and I think that this is also the way it can make a lot of meaning for us as modern Christians when we read the book. Okay, so first of all, we need to put this behind the scenes first. It is Solomon's Song of Songs. And that word, Song of Songs, the repetition, is like when we say that Jesus is the King of Kings or the Lord of Lords. It means that he is the greatest king that is above every available kings. He is the greatest Lord that is above every other ruler on the face of the earth. And so when we say that this book is the Song of Songs, we are basically saying that this book is really the greatest song that is ever written. It could be that Solomon is saying that this is the greatest song that he has written himself, and therefore it was his masterpiece. Or he could be claiming, and I'm believing this one, that he's actually saying, no, it's not even his greatest song, but this is the greatest song ever written by anyone, right? And we shall consider why this is the case, right? Before we begin, things that we need to really, get out of the way. A lot of people, they blush when they read this book, especially because it sounds erotic. It sounds like, it's PG-13 or even it's R-rated. But I think that this is really an interpretation that is caused by an over-sexualized society. That we as an over-sexualized society, we are allergic to whenever a sensual thing is presented to us, and we react negatively, when it is actually a part of everyday life. I personally think that this book can even be presented and read by a kid, of course, with parental guidance, because, romantic love and even sensual love is something that they too should be able to observe, at least in the lives of their parents, and therefore they are not oblivious to it, and they shouldn't be, right? They should be presented with the pure kind of sensual love and the holy kind of even sexual love, and to be able to see that in their parents. And when this happens, then this book doesn't need to be a taboo even to small children. And why I say that, I think it's because the book manages to be sensual without being vulgar. It manages to be contemplative without being consummative. It does contemplate sensualism, but it is not it does not consume it. It's not consummative, right? It waits until the point of marriage before that happens, right? And this book celebrates God's good gift of marriage, including its sexual component. And we can see, actually, and I will argue this later, that the couple actually does guard their chastity with vigilance. In fact, this whole book is about the guarding of the purity of marriage. And that is why I think this book is indeed one of the greatest songs about love, right? And so it is a song, and it is the greatest of songs. It is more poetic. We must see it as being imaginative, and we need to look at it from an artistic perspective. And I want us to consider actually this. What makes a song great? Right, I would like to suggest two things. The first is what it is about, and the second is who it can include, who it can invite into the picture. So first, what it is about. A great song must speak about lofty and admirable things that transcend the ages. Note how almost every song is about such lofty ideals. It must be about, virtues like love, like commitment to national ideals, about memorable days, and most of all, about God. And these are all lofty thinking, right? Note also how songs that talk about the insignificant and menial things can be a temporal hit, but never a lasting one. If you think about songs like the Korean Gangnam Style, that took over the world by a storm once, but it will not last for decades, for centuries, because it bears little meaning. It does not have the lofty ideas that it can bring forth. And consider, even for small children, how songs like the Baby Shark song, and how that compares to a song, Jesus loves me, this I know, which in simplicity actually presents lofty truths about the Bible. And so Solomon's Song of Songs then can be great because it takes mankind's greatest ideal, love, and put it into a song, right? And celebrate it and magnify it. And so this is the first reason. But I think there is another reason, and that is who the song can include and who the song invites to join into the picture. Now, I would like to actually give one example for this. Because a song that is overly specific can never be immersive for the general masses. But take, for example, this song, It Is Well With My Soul. You know that song, right? It is well with my soul. This was a hymn penned by Horatio Spafford, and it captured his indignant perseverance to trust God despite the calamity that actually took his whole family. If you don't know the history behind that song, Spafford actually lost his son, and he thought that the best way to get over it was to get his whole family, his wife and other 4 children, on a vacation. But it was during that vacation when Spafford actually sent them away first, thinking that he would actually rejoin them on a later trip. But Spafford lost his wife and 4 daughters to a shipwreck, right? And as he was brought by a ship into that very spot where the shipwreck happened, he penned the song. And knowing just this background, I think gives the story a very touching perspective. But a lot of us enjoy the song without even knowing the story behind it, because the song actually gives the kind of a more kind of a general struggle with suffering that everyone can identify with, right? And the hymn has become agelessly popular because it avoids becoming caged with the incident in a specific form. Had the song been explicitly talking about a shipwreck, I think it could have been very touching, but probably not lasting. The reason It Is Well With My Soul became a classic was because it encapsulated mankind's struggle with suffering and its interaction with the mystery of God's will. Its lamentation transcends Spafford's own, and it becomes inclusive of our own. When we sing that song, we're not singing it, in the shoes of Spafford. We are singing it through our own experiences, and that is why the song is great, because it is more general, it is more inclusive, it is more representative rather than being specific to his own. So that is why the song became great. And having said that, Solomon's Song of Songs similarly could not have been great if it had merely been a personal story of his own. If his story could not invite us to join into the story. If it had been overly specific instead of being general. If it was exclusive as opposed to being inclusive. If it had been merely personal instead of being representative to our own experiences with passion and with love. And so we'll begin the lessons by going through later on, right, the characters that is found within the song. I will also invite you to consider with me, and you can do this critically, by the way, not merely who these characters are, but what they actually represent. Who are the daughters of Jerusalem, for example, and why are they so named in a book that seems to be so Zion-centric? It brings us into that city, into Jerusalem, into Zion. And who are the watchmen that is found within that song? And why do they seem to respond to the girl's anxieties? Why are the girl and the boy's mothers mentioned, but never their fathers? Right, and those are observations within that we can find within that song. And after we have done that, I also want to invite you to think together with me why this book is included in a biblical canon. Because I think what makes a book included in a biblical canon are mostly for two reasons. One is how it can point us to Christ, right? As all scripture do, if we read John chapter 5, verse 39. And also how the book can instruct us for godly living. Again, as all scripture do, if you read 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 to 17. And so these are elements of a song, right? And we need to consider these. All right, so the second point of today's session is identifying who the singer is. Because if we look at the song, it actually takes on the perspective of the girl. The majority of the song is actually from the perspective of the girl. But this can actually be because, the author wanting to provide the song a more emotional perspective, and that kind of perspective is better shared when it is shared from a feminine perspective. So let's dive into this, right? Who is this singer? Okay, so we've considered how this was the Song of Songs, and that is the greatest song. Um, and now we shall consider how this is Solomon's Song of Songs. Because the term of Solomon in the Hebrew can actually mean that it was by Solomon. It could mean that it was for Solomon, or it could mean that it was about Solomon, or that it was written in Solomonic tradition. This means that Solomon could have been its author, but also its audience, or that the wisdom of Solomon could have been the very tradition it was written under. Of course, one of the most difficult parts about identifying this song with Solomon, and I think anyone who reads it might be able to protest when they try to connect the song with the story of the life of Solomon, was because Solomon was openly polygamous. He had a lot of wives, and therefore it was very unlikely that he could have written such a song that celebrates the purity, exclusivity, and the intimacy of marriage. Which is why to justify that this song was written by Solomon, a lot of theologians have postulated that Solomon might have written the Song of Songs in his early life, and therefore before his first marriage, and when his ideal for marriage was still pure and uncorrupted. Right, and perhaps Proverbs was written in the middle of his life, and Ecclesiastes in his old age, when he had repented of his sins and he was looking back and lamenting about his indulgent life. So that could have been the case, right? We don't know, because one of the marks of the Solomonic books, or those books that are identified as being of Solomon, is that it never clearly states, vividly states that Solomon was its uncontested author. But nonetheless, the Song of Songs actually shares a lot of vocabulary and style with Ecclesiastes, and which is why the two books most probably share a common author. Which is why my personal opinion is that Ecclesiastes is mostly Solomon, and the Song of Songs is really Solomon's writing. Right, and the strongest reason that this song is not by Solomon but rather for Solomon, and so this is from the other side, is how the main protagonist of this song was actually the girl. Right, the song is written mainly from the perspective of the girl, which we are going to see in the coming weeks, that was longing passionately for the figure of this idealized royal king, which was vaguely identified as Solomon. However, I personally still maintain that the song was written by Solomon, right? And the usage of the perspective of the girl was mainly to provide a feminine perspective to it, a more emotional perspective to the whole song. It gives a lot more drama to the song, but it also makes the song then applicable to the church as the bride of Christ. But maybe also because of the controversial figure of Solomon and the fact that he had many wives, it is perhaps wiser if the author is indeed concealed or not being made clear. But personally, I still maintain that the song was written by Solomon and not as a narcissistic song that idealized his own figure and made him the desired husband. Rather, this was actually Solomon writing about man's general desire for intimacy. It would have made sense to think that Solomon wrote this in his early life when he was not yet corrupted by his polygamous idolatry, but this is something that we need not hold for certain. But for this week, at least, what I want you to do is this. Read the Song of Songs. If possible, do so repeatedly. Familiarize yourself with it so that when we read it again together, you can begin to identify along and perhaps even disagree how the song comes together with each movement or with each stanza. Okay, so the third thing that we want to identify today is the movements within the song. Because most songs have an artistic structure to them, what we in modern times call stanzas, choruses, refrains, etc. So as you read the song, I want to suggest to you the movements that are happening within the song. In modern terms, this will help us to identify which stanza we are reading from, and then stitch together the larger theme of the song. All right, so those that are more theologically inclined may actually come back with a proposed structure of their own, but I want to suggest one, so at least every reader can follow along with a suggested framework instead of coming with a blank mind. But you can disagree with this, right? But I propose that there are actually three movements within a song, and it can be deciphered with this sentence: the daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. So you can see that, this exact phrase being repeated three times within a book: in chapter 2 verse 7, in chapter 3 verse 5, and in chapter 8 verse 4. And why is this important? Because the last of such requests is actually in the very last chapter of the book. And when we consider the charge that was given by the girl to the daughters of Jerusalem, it was actually like a plea to them to guard her. You know, do not arouse or awaken love. Those are actually two Hebrew words repeated and placed alongside one another, and so you can actually say, do not arouse love, or do not awaken love. And so the English translation, I think, rightly choose two synonyms to make the repetition a lot, to make more sense, right? But it's actually a repetition. So do not arouse love until it so desires. And so this is actually a plea by the girl, you know, so that the friends will guard her in protecting her chastity, in protecting her purity, and so that she does not go beyond the line, you know, do not awaken love until it so desires, and until it is ready to be consummated. And the fact that the last one of this charge actually happens in the last chapter of this book, in chapter 8 verse 4, for me actually means that this whole song was premarital. You know, it was penned for premarital times. The marriage has not happened. It has not been consummated, right? And so I said again, I want to suggest the movements as this, right? That chapter 1 and chapter 2 talks about courtship and the desire for marriage, and you will see that it ends with a call to turn away. Right, and then in chapters 3 to 6, this is actually happening in a state of dream and even a state of nightmare, right? And it talks about the anxieties of relationships, and it ends with a call to turn back. And in chapters 7 and 8, we'll talk about the decision for marriage, and it will end with a call to flee suddenly. Right. The reason I have divided the song this way is because the second movement, if you look at chapters 3 to 6, seem to refer not to actual scenes, but one that is experienced by the girl in a state of dream. You can turn, for example, to chapter 3, verse 1, which indicates that the girl was looking for her lover on my bed, so on her bed, even though she appeared to roam through the streets and even meeting the watchman in chapter 3, verses 2 to 3. And but despite the fact that she seemed to be roaming, didn't change the fact that this was experienced to her by her on her bed, and therefore, seemingly this was actually a dream, right? And in chapter 5, verse 2, okay, she still remarked, that I slept, but my heart was awake. And the experience felt so real to her that it was becoming undiscernible from real life. And so chapter 3, we see her on her bed, and chapter 5, verse 2, we see that she was sleeping, but her heart was awake. And therefore, this caused me to put the chapter 3 to 6 as being this dream and nightmare state. All right, so it was not a real scene. And this is, I think, the mistakes of some commentators. I disagree with them that say that the marriage has happened in this middle movement, because I think that that marriage actually happened in a dream state, and therefore they have not actually been married. It was still a dream to begin with, right? And so seeing chapters 3 to 6 in this kind of dream state or even a nightmare gives the movement a more vivid meaning. In the dreams, the girl's hope and fears are more explicitly expressed, even to the point of being personified. Note, for example, how the watchmen within the song are characters that appear only in this middle movement, right, in chapters 3 to 6. And they always appear whenever the girl was anxiously looking for her lover. It is as if the watchman were the personified figure of the girl's own inner emotions. And what this means will become clearer as we go through the songs together. But I want you to note this kind of, symbolic meanings within the song, and especially within the chapters 3 to 6, so that we can see how the movements actually happen. But for now, I want to suggest the overarching theme of the book. Since the charge to the daughters of Jerusalem appear to the very end of the book, and that is until chapter 8, my own understanding is that the whole song takes the scene of a premarital romance. This is why, right to the very end of the book, it was still not yet time to arouse or awaken love. And it is important to see it this way, because this is then is a book about the girl's passionate defense for her purity and chastity until the day of love's consummation, or until the day of marriage. When interpreted this way, the song will bear a more universal meaning for the Church of Christ, as we too must guard with all vigilance our purity. For we are, in Paul's words, promised to one husband, to Christ as a pure virgin to him. You can see 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. In this way, the song has a far-reaching relevance across all ages, and it is indeed one depicting a lofty virtue and a quest that we all share. In this way, we can indeed call it the greatest song of all time, because we too are now invited into this song to experience the song together with its author, with the girl in a story, as we too defend our purity in this day and age. And that, I believe, is the structure for the Song of Songs. All right, so just as a closing, right? This is the structure that we will begin to look at in the coming weeks, right? Next week, we'll actually talk first about each of the character that appears in the song. But this will be the construction that we will slowly put into the picture, right? There are 3 movements in the book, marked by the black box, the charge to the daughters of Jerusalem not to arouse or awaken love until it so desires. So you can find that in each of the movements, right? And how this will actually then be put together, right? And I'm just putting this up front, so you do not need to be bothered about this first, but just so you know what we will actually be going through in the weeks to come. And so with that, God bless.